Hey everyone, this is Jeff Bat with Learning Dojo, and today we're going to be talking about and really diving into storyline triggers. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so if you haven't checked out any of my courses, make sure that you go to learningdojo.ninja, go into the Udemy courses, and you can see courses on Storyline 360, Captivate, XAPI, Articulate Rise, Custom SCORM, as well as HTML5 video. So go ahead and check that out. But today we're going to dive into the Articulate storyline triggers and talk about all the different parts of Articulate storyline triggers. And so you can understand them a little bit more and use them to enhance your course and make your course a little bit more interactive. So we're inside of Storyline at the moment. I don't have anything really on this page. It's just a blank page to begin with. But I'm going to go ahead and insert a button here. Now this button is just going to be a sample button that we can work with. So I'm going to say sample and just type in my text right there. Now you can add a trigger by coming over to the right-hand side and clicking on this trigger button. Now there are different parts of the trigger that are helpful to understand. The first part is the action section. The second part is the when. When does this trigger actually happen? And then the last part is conditionals. When in certain conditions does this trigger actually happen? Do you want it to happen all the time? Or do you want it to happen in only certain situations? And that is what a conditional is. Now, if you're at all familiar with code or JavaScript or anything like that, these are terms that you use all the time inside of JavaScript or any other type of coding language. Now, the action depends on what you want to have the learner do. Do you want the learner to jump to a certain page? Do you want the learner to see additional content? So these are different things that you can do. If you select this little drop-down box, you can see change the state of some object. You can also see show a layer or hide a layer, or show a light box or move something on the stage. So this is essentially what you need to do. And the first thing that you decide is what needs to happen. Do you need to move to a different page? Do you need to show some content or anything like that? Or do you need to actually change a variable? Do you need to increase a score of a game or something like that? You can come down to adjust variable. Do you need to pause the timeline so the learner can reflect on something or interact with something before they continue the timeline? Do you need to open a URL? Do you need to execute some JavaScript and so forth? So that's really the first step when you're creating a trigger. The first step is to figure out what do you want to actually have happen? What do you want the learner to do when they click on this button? And really the next item is defining what action you actually choose. So if I come in here and say jump to next slide, well, defining the action is saying what slide do you jump to. So if I select on this drop-down box, I can jump to the next slide, I can jump to the previous slide, or I can jump to a very specific slide. So again, I'm defining the action a little bit more. Now this will change depending on the action that I actually have chosen. So if I come in here and choose jump to scene, you can see that now I choose the scene. But if I come over here and select move, well, it's going to allow me to define what I'm moving, what object, and so I can, on whatever object is on the stage, I can choose what object I want, and then I can choose a custom path. You can have several different paths on one object, and you can move that object. Now, if I come into here and say adjust variable, then it allows me to choose which variable is actually adjusted. So these are the kinds of things that you can do or adjust depending on the trigger that you have selected. So that's really something important to know, is once you have the actual action selected, you define that action in the next section there. So now it takes us down to the second section here, which is really the when. When does this happen? Now, a lot of the times we stick with the click. Right now it's selected, okay, when the user clicks on something, I'm going to go ahead and just jump to slide here, and it's going to be the next slide. But right here is when the user clicks, and what do they click on? So we're defining that when here. But there's a lot more that you can do. You can do so much more than just click. If I select this drop-down box, you can see double clicks, right clicks, hovers. So when I hover over, when a state is a certain object as well, you can have this happen. And so we're defining the action that happens, but we're also defining when this action actually happens. And there's a lot to choose from when an object intersects. And so if you have two different objects animating, and as soon as they intersect, you want to have some type of trigger, you can do that as well. Or when the object intersection ends, and so as soon as they intersect and as soon as they kind of end intersecting, that's when that trigger will actually happen as well. Or when the object enters a slide, or when the object leaves a slide. And so if you have them animating out, and as soon as it leaves, you can have some type of trigger happen as well at that point. But there's so much more. So when the slider moves, so if you have a slider and you can define, okay, if the slider gets to a certain point, then you can have this action happen. If the dial moves, you can do that based on the dial control as well. Or when a variable gets a certain amount. So if you have a score and you're building some type of game and the score gets to, let's say, 800 points, you could have them, congratulations, you won the game or something like that. So you could have this action kind of listening for the score to get to a certain point, or for the name to have a certain type of value. And so there's a lot of flexibility in just that alone. Now, if I come down to media completes, so as soon as an audio file completes, there may be more on the timeline, but as soon as that audio file completes, you can have some type of trigger. When the user presses a certain type of key. Now, again, anything that I select allows me to define, kind of opens up in this section, define a little bit more about that. So which key am I looking for? Well, the letter J or something like that. You can just enter in that letter there. All right, so other things, object loses focus. And so once they click on it, but if they click on something else, that's when the object loses focus. When the timeline starts, if you want something to happen as soon as the timeline starts, not specifically in a media on the timeline, but when the timeline itself starts, then you can go ahead and you can have something happen at that point. Or when the timeline ends, when the timeline reaches the very end of a certain point, you can have that something happen at the end of the timeline. And then lastly, when the timeline reaches a certain point, so if you want the timeline to reach 5 seconds and then have something happen, you can have that this trigger happen as well. And then also down at the bottom is drag and drop events. So you can really get custom with your drag and drop events, and you can have something happen when they drag over something. You can change a state. You can add a point if they drag over an item, or even drop on a certain item as well. So if I click that, I define the object, and then I define what the target that they drop on is going to be as well, and I can get custom there. And so that's really getting used to these allows you to go beyond just, the click to reveal type of interactions where you click on something and you reveal something like that, which is pretty basic. But now you can have games where an object intersects, or when your score gets above 800, or when your score gets all the way to 1,000 points or something like that. You can have these triggers actually happen. And so really to get these interactions more interactive, what I would suggest is exploring more of this when section. When something actually happens, this is when the trigger happens. I've seen a lot of people use these different triggers, but I haven't seen a lot of people go beyond just kind of the standard click and having something happen when the click happens, or something different besides the click happens. And the last one is the conditionals. Now, conditionals basically say that this action, when this happens, will happen, but in only certain situations. It'll only happen if this is true, or if they have 800 points, or if they've completed everything else, or you can set these different types of conditions. Now, if I click on this condition, it allows me to check these items, and essentially a condition is saying, okay, this is going to run, but only in these certain situations, and you set those situations. And you can do it based off of 3 different things. You can do it based off of a variable. And so if you say that a variable is a certain name, or a certain number, then you run this action if that variable is true. Or you can do it based off of an object. So if they've visited each state has a visited state, you can then run this action. Or the last one is window. So the window is the slide is inside of the player frame, or the slide is lightbox. So if there is a lightbox slide, you can actually have a trigger run if the slide itself is being lightboxed and you only want an action to happen once it's lightboxed. So there's those different things that you can do: the variables, the objects, and the window. Now on each of those, if I were to select, let's select an object, now it allows me to define that condition. If the state of button is equal to normal. Now, if I have other states, which I don't in this button, but if I have hovered, down, or visited or something like that, I can say if button state is equal to visited, then run this action. I could do more than that. I can actually have more than one condition. If I add this, I can say, well, I also want to check to see if this variable is true. Now, I don't have a variable created, so I'm going to go ahead and create a variable. And I'm going to say test and select this drop-down box to true or false. And we're going to set it to false by default. And then I'm going to select OK here. And now it's going to say that if button 1 is visited and test, the variable test is equal to false, let's actually do equal to true because it's equal to false by default, then it's going to run this action. And it's going to run this action when the user drops on this certain amount. So you're defining, okay, this action will happen still with this event, and when this actually event happens, but it'll only run in these certain types of conditions. So keep that in mind. Now this word right here is key. Do I want this condition to be true and this condition to be true in order for this to run? You can select this drop-down box and you can say or as well. So what we're essentially doing now is we're saying that this condition needs to be true or this condition needs to be true. So either one can be true. If this one can be true or the other one can be true, it doesn't matter. Just one of those ones have to be true. But if I switch this over to and, it's really defining it, saying that both of these have to be true in order for this to work. And so it's not going to work unless both of those conditions are true. Now, if I go ahead and select OK, that pretty much sets one condition, but we're not considering other conditions that may happen. What if the button state is equal to visited, but the test is equal to false? What happens? Well, if nothing happens, it could be portrayed as something is broken, something's not working, and so it could be portrayed as a user error. And so that's why I like to consider what will happen if this isn't met. And so I probably need to have another trigger, and I need to do something else, like maybe show a message or something like that that tells the learner what to do before, if they haven't met the criteria. So if they need to go do this, they haven't done this, go do that, and then you meet the criteria. And that way the learner is not confused thinking that the button is not working or something like that. So that was a little bit of a deep dive into triggers for Storyline, and it really these different parts of it. So the action, what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. And so when the button clicks, like think of a remote, when the button is clicked, it's going to run some type of trigger, the volume up, volume down, channel change, or things like that. Or even like, when I get up and I turn off the light, or when I get up and click on a button on a computer or something like that. You're thinking about when this actual action will happen. And then the final thing is, okay, well, I only want this to happen in certain conditions. I only want it to happen if this is true and that is true and they've visited this and done things like that. That's when you're working with conditionals. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. Again, if you wanted to dive a little bit more into Storyline 360, check out my website, learningdojo.ninja. Select the Udemy courses and then go down to Storyline 360. And then you can check out my course on Storyline 360. Or if you want to learn about other things like Captivate or XAPI or Articulate Rise, you can check out those courses as well. But thank you for checking out this video, and I hope you liked it. I'll see you in the next video.